Of course, there's also the lens cap from a video camera we found on the hill overlooking the farm, the old woman continued. My guess is the criminal wanted to videotape the giant when he arrived, though I'm still not certain why. And lastly, Mayor Charming showed up and Is Mayor Charming an ever after? Why, yes, Liebling, he's Prince Charming. The little girl squealed in delight. We met a celebrity. Mrs. Grimm chuckled and then broke into a full laugh when she noticed the scowl on Mr. Canis's face. As I was saying, Mayor Charming showed up and tried to get us to quit our investigation, Mrs. Grimm continued. If the house had really just fallen like he said, he wouldn't bother to come by and check on it. He knows something he's not telling. When he first showed up, he was angry that someone he called the Three hadn't done a good job cleaning up the place, Daphne offered. The Three isn't a person. They're a coven of witches, Glinda the Good Witch, Morgan the Fay, and the gingerbread house witch, Frau Pfefferkuchenhaus. They work for the mayor as magical advisors, but what they really do is sweep trouble under the carpet. I thought you said that ever-afters gave up their magic, Sabrina snapped, hoping she had caught the old woman in a lie. No, I said some of them did. I'm sure there's still plenty of stuff hidden away in closets and attics all over Fairyport Landing, Mrs. Grimm replied, including, apparently, a magic bean I wasn't even aware existed. Let's go inside. Fairyport Landing Memorial Hospital was tiny, at least compared to the giant skyscraper hospital Sabrina was familiar with in New York City. It had 2 floors and no ambulances in front of the emergency room door. They left Mr. Canis in the car as they headed inside, past a short, squat man with 2 huge companions waiting by the hospital door. They were impeccably dressed in expensive suits, perfectly tailored to fit their extreme frames. The short man stared at Sabrina, sending a flash of heat to her face. We look like idiots, Sabrina thought as she tried to tug her high-water pants down a little. Inside, doctors and nurses rushed around the brightly lit hallways. The place smelled of cleaner and antiseptic. The 3 Grimms managed to maneuver through the chaos and approach the information desk, where a portly receptionist sat talking on his phone. His round face was friendly, and when he saw them, he put the phone to his chest and smiled. Can I help you, ladies? We're here to see Mr. Appleby. He was in an accident recently, Mrs. Grimm said. Oh, yes, Thomas. He's in room 222, the receptionist replied. Popular fellow. He just had 3 visitors. Mrs. Grimm cocked an eyebrow. Indeed, where do I sign in? The receptionist handed the old woman a clipboard, and she signed her name. Before she handed it back, she quickly pointed out 3 names on the list to the girls. A Mr. William Charming, a Mr. Seven, and a Miss Glinda South. She rushed the girls down a hallway and through 2 double doors, then made a left, stopping at an elevator. She impatiently pushed the up button several times. Why are we rushing? Sabrina asked. Because Charming is here to erase the farmer's memory, the old woman said, as the elevator doors slid open and they stepped inside. To do what? Sabrina cried. But Mrs. Grimm ignored her question. They got out on the 2nd floor, found room 222, and hurried inside. On the bed was Thomas Appleby, a weathered old man with his left arm in a sling. His right leg was encased in plaster and held above the bed by a pulley system. Sabrina winced at how painful it looked and thought he was lucky to be asleep. Standing over him were Mayor Charming, Mr. Seven, still wearing his insulting hat, and a woman wearing a diamond tiara and a silver and gold dress. She was slowly emptying a bag of pink dust onto Mr. Appleby. When she saw Mrs. Grimm, she When she saw Mrs. Grimm, she dumped the entire contents out all over the man and shoved the bag into her purse. "Glinda," Mrs. Grimm cried, "I thought you were supposed to be a good witch." Glinda's face flushed bright red. "We all have to pay our bills, Relda," she said as she lowered her head and quickly made her way to the door. "Save your indignation," Charming added as he and Mr. Seven followed. "This is part of my job." "Oh dear, Appleby will never be able to tell us anything," Relda Grimm said loudly, as if for the benefit of Charming and his team. "Without an eyewitness, we're never going to get to the bottom of this mystery." She looked at the girls and pressed her finger to her lips so they would be quiet. After several seconds, she poked her head out of the room. "They're gone." "What are we doing here?" Sabrina asked. She didn't feel comfortable waiting around in the hospital room of a man she didn't even know, especially since people were dumping what looked like the contents of vacuum cleaner bags all over him. "We're waiting." "For who?" Daphne asked. But no sooner had she said it than a thin, frail woman with gray-streaked black hair entered the room. "Can I help you?" she asked, eyeing the old woman and the girls with suspicion. "Mrs. Appleby, I'm Relda Grimm, and these are my granddaughters, Sabrina and Daphne. We heard about the accident. Are you all right?" Mrs. Grimm asked. "Oh, I'm fine. Thank you for asking. Do you know my husband?" "No, but I happen to do a little detective work from time to time, and I was thinking I might be able to help. How is he?" Mrs. Appleby gazed down at the injured man and smiled sadly. "To be honest, I'm a little worried about him. He was raving earlier. He told the wildest story. The doctors gave him a sedative to calm him down. Wait a minute, he's waking up," she said as he began to stir. "Thomas, how are you feeling?" Mrs. Appleby asked as she sat next to his bed and rubbed his hand. "Deborah, who are these people?" the farmer asked his wife. "They're with the police," Mrs. Appleby replied. Mrs. Grimm stepped forward. "Not the police, dear. Detectives. It's kind of a hobby. My granddaughters and I are very glad to see you weren't too badly injured, considering." "You three are detectives?" Mr. Appleby looked from Mrs. Grimm to the children suspiciously. "Yes," Mrs. Grimm said, causing Daphne to practically swell with pride. "Well, I think a crime has been committed, Mrs. Grimm," Mr. Appleby said. "You do?" "They should arrest whoever dressed your granddaughters this way. Thomas, be nice. I think they look adorable." Mrs. Appleby cried, "I'm sorry. He's been a grouch since we got here. He doesn't like hospitals." Sabrina looked down at her goofy outfit and seethed with anger. Who would buy a girl who was almost 12 a shirt with a monkey on it? "Well, what can I do for you, Mrs. Grimm?" Mr. Appleby grunted. "Do you remember anything about the accident?" the old woman said. "What accident?" the farmer asked. Mrs. Grimm frowned. "What accident?" Mrs. Appleby exclaimed. "Thomas, the house has been destroyed. I found you lying in the field unconscious. You don't remember?" "I don't know what you're talking about. There's nothing wrong with the house," Mr. Appleby argued. "Oh dear, the painkillers are really doing a number on him," Mrs. Appleby said, shifting in her seat to face them. "Mrs. Grimm, I don't think my husband is up to talking right now." "I understand. Perhaps you might have a moment to spare us then." "Of course." Mrs. Appleby gestured for them to follow her into the hallway. "So sorry to trouble you," Mrs. Grimm said to the farmer as they walked away toward the door. "I do hope you feel better soon, Mr. Appleby." Daphne stopped and turned to the injured man. "I like my outfit," she said, and stuck her tongue out. Mr. Appleby stuck his tongue out too, and the little girl stomped out of the room. "He's acting very odd right now," Mrs. Appleby said when they were in the hallway. "I'm considering taking him out of this hospital." "Oh, I'm sure he's in good hands. So you said he was raving about something?" Mrs. Grimm prompted. "It's silly. He swore he'd seen... Well, this is crazy, but he said he'd seen a giant." "He did?" Sabrina gasped. "Wouldn't that be a sight?" Mrs. Grimm chuckled. "But I have a different theory about what happened," Mrs. Appleby explained. "There was a man who came out to to the farm several times, asking us if we would rent the place to him for a night. He said he was making a movie or something, and was very friendly at first, but when Thomas refused, he got quite nasty. How unfortunate. Has he come back? Mrs. Grimm asked. Well, that's just it. A week later, he did come back and apologized for being so rude. He said he wanted to make it up to us, so he booked us into a fancy hotel in New York City. All expenses paid, with tickets to a Broadway show. I haven't had a vacation in years. Farming is a tough business, so I was thrilled. How nice. Did you enjoy your vacation? Not at all. When I got there, I found that the hotel didn't have any record of our reservation, and the tickets to go to the show were counterfeit. Mrs. Appleby said angrily, I should have stayed home with Thomas. Didn't your husband go with you? Mrs. Grimm asked. Oh no, he doesn't care for the city much, Mrs. Appleby sighed. I took my sister. We had to use our own money for a hotel, and the only place with a room was infested with bedbugs. How dreadful, Mrs. Grimm sympathized. Mrs. Appleby, this man's name didn't happen to be Charming, did it? Oh no, it was an Englishman, the woman replied, sniffing. I remember because Thomas said he had one of those accents they have over there. I thought it was a funny coincidence, his last name and the accent. Well, what did this Englishman look like? I'm sorry, I never saw him. Thomas had all the dealings with him. Mrs. Appleby, I'm sure you want to get back to your husband, but I have one last question. Do either of you own a video camera? Mrs. Grimm took a clean handkerchief out of her handbag and offered it to the woman. Sabrina noticed a soft pink powder fell from it as the woman wiped her eyes. It was the same color as the stuff Glinda had dumped all over the farmer. No, Mr. Appleby is a little tight with the money, if you know what I mean. Suddenly, Sabrina noticed a change in the woman's face. It seemed to wipe itself of all emotion, and her eyes drifted into a blank stare. What were you saying? She asked in a distant voice. I hear you had a wonderful time in New York City, Mrs. Grimm said. The musical was the best thing you had ever experienced. Okay, Mrs. Appleby said. Then she turned and went into her husband's room without saying goodbye. Mrs. Grimm pulled her notebook out of her handbag and scribbled away. So the plot thickens. More proof of a giant. That man is full of medications. He doesn't know what he's talking about. There's no such thing as giants, Sabrina said. A little bit louder than she meant to. The declaration echoed down the hospital hallway. Sabrina, Daphne shouted. Listen, I don't know where you live, but my sister and I are here on Earth, where things can easily be explained without having to consider giants, Sabrina said in a much lower tone. This Mr. Englishman wanted to rent their farm to make a movie. When the farmer wouldn't agree, he tried to trick them into leaving so he could do it when they weren't around. Something went wrong on the set, and he accidentally blew the place up. Charming has an English accent. He's Englishman. Sabrina, I'm proud of you, Mrs. Grimm said as she led them into the elevator. You have incredible skills of deduction. You looked at the clues and chose the most likely path to solve the crime. You're going to make a great detective. But your theory only raises more questions. First, Charming isn't a filmmaker. Why would he want to videotape the farm? Secondly, what about the giant footprint? Maybe Charming is making a campaign commercial. He is the mayor after all. And as for the house, maybe it was a gas leak. Buildings blow up all the time in New York because someone left the stove burning. Brilliant. The town does have an election in the near future, so the campaign commercial is worth considering. And the gas leak is a valid theory. Still, there's one loose end. When things blow up, pieces fly everywhere. Appleby's house is all in a pile, like it was squashed from above, Mrs. Grimm pointed out. The elevator stopped, and the Grimms stepped into the busy emergency room lobby. I agree with Granny. The house was stomped on, Daphne said. Sabrina shot her an angry look. And I think I know who was responsible, said Mrs. Grimm. Really? Who? Daphne squealed. I think you'll enjoy it more if it's a surprise. Excuse me, ladies, a voice said as three men emerged from the deep shadows that lined the pathway to the parking lot. They were the same men in suits who had watched them when they'd entered the hospital. The small, dumpy one held a crowbar he kept smacking into his gloved hand. The men on either side of him stood like huge, muscle-bound bookends to their much shorter leader. One glance told Sabrina the men were trouble. We hear you've been asking some questions about a certain farm, the dumpy leader continued. Then you've heard correctly, Mrs. Grimm said as she placed herself squarely between the girls and the thugs. Daphne grabbed her sister's hand and squeezed tightly, but Sabrina hardly noticed. She was too awestruck by the old woman's courage. Just a friendly warning, Relda, if you know what's good for you. You'll just forget about the whole thing, the leader said with a dark smile. If I knew what was good for me, I wouldn't be in this line of work, Mrs. Grimm replied. I seem to be at a disadvantage, young man. You know my name, but I don't know yours. Or better yet, who the unfortunate employer is who hired the likes of you three. Tell him he should know it takes more than 3 goons to scare me. Now, good night. She tried to pass the men, but as she did, the leader grabbed her arm and pulled her close to his fat face. Some people can't take a hint, he barked. Young man, if you don't let us pass, you are going to regret it, Mrs. Grimm said. Sabrina's heart began to pound. How could Mrs. Grimm be so calm? These men were about to tear her apart. Is that so? The head goon growled. The old woman pulled a little silver whistle from around her neck and blew it. No sound could be heard. It was broken. When she put it back inside her dress, she smiled. Yes, that's so.